if you want to give me the thumbs up. Okay, recording. Cool. Okay, hello to everyone who's watching this recording, and thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. I'm Jordan McCrae, president of the Political Ecology Working Group at the University of Kentucky and one of the co-chairs of Dope 11. It's such an honor to introduce the Dope 11 keynote address, which is taking a different form than in previous years. Due to the compounding crises in Texas of climate change and governmental neglect that occurred the week of the conference, we were unable to hold the event as scheduled on February 20th at 5:30 p.m. EST. However, Dr. Reese so graciously still wanted to share her thoughts on the current moment with us all, so we decided to have a recorded conversation instead. After this brief introduction, Dr. Reese will give an abridged talk titled The Impossibility of Return, Crises and Care at the End of This World, followed by a discussion with the DOPE organizers. But first, I'll turn it over to Jed to read Dr. Reese's bio.
Thanks, Jordan. My name is Jed. I'm the vice president of the Political Ecology Working Group and one of the fellow co-chairs of DOPE 11. Dr. Ashanté Reese earned a PhD in anthropology from American University in 2015. She also holds a Bachelor of Arts in History with a minor in African American Studies from Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. Broadly speaking, Dr. Reese works at the intersection of critical food studies and Black geographies, examining the ways Black people produce and navigate food-related spaces and places in the context of anti-Blackness. Animated by this question, who and what survives, much of Dr. Reese's work has focused on the everyday strategies Black people employ while navigating inequity. Her first book, Black Food Geographies, Race, Self-Reliance, and Food Access in Washington, D.C., takes up these themes through an ethnographic exploration of anti-Blackness and food access. Black Food Geographies won the 2020 Best Monograph Award from the Association for the Study of Food and Society. Her second book, Black Food Matters, Racial Justice in the Wake of Food Justice, is a collection co-edited with Hannah Garth that explores the geographic, social, and cultural dimensions of food and Black life across the US. Currently, Dr. Reese is working on a new project that explores the continuity of plantation geographies and abolition possibilities within rural and urban food systems vis-a-vis the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's agribusiness sector. Thank you, Dr. Reese, for being with us today.
Awesome. Thank you, Jed. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank all of the conference chairs and organizers for inviting me to be a keynote for a conference that I've been following for a pretty long time now. So Jed, Helen, Jacob, Catherine, Olivia, Jack, Carly, Christian, Emra, Aylin, Zena, Annalise, and Corin, thank you. And a special shout out to Jordan McCrae, who's been the primary person answering all of my questions and text and keeping me abreast of all necessary details for the conference. Secondly, I would just like to say I wish that we would have been able to do this together 9 days ago at the scheduled time on February 20th. It was a time I was very much looking forward to, but I'm glad that we can at least share together in this way. When Jordan reached out to me about the theme for this year's conference, one of the things she mentioned was that the graduate student workers were exhausted, that this year's theme was in part inspired by that exhaustion because organizers wanted to think about that depletion on multiple levels in the context of ongoing public health, social, and ecological crises. A year ago, many thought that the COVID-19 pandemic would slow things down. We would have time to read and to meditate and to do yoga and perhaps take up a new hobby. A year later, we know better. The work has not slowed down, and in some cases, it has sped up. Tenure files have not paused. They simply have a section marked pandemic. The teaching hasn't stopped. It has, in most cases, only transformed into versions that feel harder for many of us. Expected progress toward the completion of masters and PhDs is still unsurprisingly expected. The talks like this one that used to be in rooms where we could gather together are unceasing, recorded and stored for use into an indeterminable future. Nothing has slowed down despite the gendered pressures of child and elder care and the mental and physical impacts of perpetual grieving and loss. Life, as Deb Cohen remarked in a recent talk, is in motion. It's always in motion. Thus, as a regime of motion that structures our lives, capitalism's script already predicted this inability or unwillingness to slow down, and the ways technological infrastructure ensures that work can, in fact, speed up, leaving many to feel as though they are not doing enough and hardly ever working enough. But that script is necessarily partial and is always incomplete. Through mutual aid, care, and various forms of resistance, people have the opportunity to do what Sadia Hartman writes about in Wayward Lives' Beautiful Experiments, to create other arrangements of the possible. These other arrangements reveal alternative priorities and values that run counter to deeply entrenched individualism and dispossession. Often choreographed, orchestrated, and led by those who are unacknowledged, unseen, unappreciated, or unvalidated by dominant paradigms and structures, these other arrangements disrupt, they rupture, they interrupt violent epistemes and practices on various levels. In the original version of this talk, I wanted to use this time to experiment, to contribute to that archive of ruptures that intercede on, pause, and push back against the ways capitalism attempts to choreograph our lives in and through disaster. I was thinking, and I'm still thinking about the questions, what if a keynote at an academic conference becomes a different arrangement? What if we use this space not for a unidirectional exchange of knowledge, but as a relational experience, perhaps, again, an experiment? The original keynote was experiential, one in which the form of a typical academic talk would be abandoned in favor of using restorative yoga, music, and silence as the primary modes of learning and relating. Talking in that context was secondary. What I didn't know when I was planning for it was that a series of snow and ice storms would roll through Texas, resulting in massive power failures that were supposed to be rolling blackouts, only they never rolled, leaving many in panic during the abnormally freezing temperatures, unplowed roads, inadequate number and locations of warming centers, and food and water scarcity. I, along with many others in the city, turned to mutual aid as a way to meet some of people's immediate needs. In short, what I had planned was not possible, not only because I was in the middle of crisis with other Texans, but also because I was mentally and physically exhausted. What does rest look and feel like during acute crisis? How does one rest when the work you're doing is filling the intentional gaps created by state failures? Is rest even possible for the brokenhearted? For the original talk, I was thinking with Anna Singh's concept of assemblages, which I still find quite useful as I think through the events of the past couple of weeks. She writes, assemblages are open-ended gatherings. They allow us to ask about communal effects without assuming them. They show us potential histories in the making. Assemblages don't just gather lifeways, they make them. Thinking through assemblages urges us to ask, how do gatherings sometimes become happenings, that is, greater than the sum of their parts? If history without progress is indeterminate and multidirectional, might assemblages show us its possibilities? While Singh's use of assemblages is to think through and perhaps theorize the Anthropocene, I'm not necessarily interested in advancing an argument about it or any other word that takes scene and affix it to itself. Rather, I'm thinking them useful for questioning the logics of progress as a framework for understanding movement, lives, precarity, and differently positioned futures. Singh writes that neither tales of progress or ruin tell us how to think about collaborative survival, but perhaps those who live and labor without recognition do. Perhaps plants teach us these things. Perhaps music and movement also. Perhaps thinking differently about how to present a talk or an academic paper or organizing a class. Perhaps the spaces where world-making projects overlap teach us these things. In other words, perhaps everything between progress and ruin helps us rearrange what is possible. But before we could do that, I think we have to acknowledge a thing that has been a part of discourse around both in academia and beyond, and this idea of return. And so we must acknowledge that there actually is no return. We have to acknowledge it and we have to grieve it. Christina Sharp asks, What does it mean to return? Is a return possible? Is it desired? And if it is, under what conditions and for whom? These questions, I think, are instructive. They are an invitation to sit with and reflect on the language of and movement towards a mythical norm that we can all return back to go back to normal, to go back to in-person teaching, to go back, to go back, to go back. When or if this pandemic is contained, that favorite coffee shop that you went to may no longer be there. The place where you practice yoga is gone too. The person who used to chat with you while she cleaned your office on campus is also gone, perhaps laid off or worse, passed away due to university's unwillingness to offer necessary protections for its workers. Here, I just want to make a little bit of a pause to make a distinction between protection and care. While there's a proliferation of new programs and research on care in the workplace, a lot of workplace wellness stuff, et cetera, particularly in universities, I think we must pause and wonder, what care could an institution that never wanted many of us to survive or be there offer? If and when the pandemic eases, other forms of precarity will continue. To put it plainly, the geography of the norm doesn't exist. It has been altered, transformed into something else that we have yet to fully know. The deaths, the losses, the infrastructures built to support living within our computers, as we're doing now for this talk, they have written us toward futures in which the past will continue to show up and disrupt the present. But if we accept precarity as a condition of our time, how might we move, think, and be different? So a few words on gifting as a form of care. Care has shown up implicitly as a theme in almost all of my work. In the past year or so, I've turned my attention toward thinking about it, defining and practicing care, not only with those with whom I share close relationships, but also as a praxis for moving through and against capitalist accumulation and precarity. In their introductory essay to a special issue on care, Hi'ile Hobart and Tamara Nice define radical care as a set of vital but underappreciated strategies for enduring precarious worlds. Carefully laying out a genealogy of care in both academic and activist lineages, Hobart and Nice stress that while care is most often associated with a feeling, it has meaning and application well beyond that of feeling for others. Instead, they write, theorized as an affective connective tissue between an inner self and an outer world, care constitutes a feeling with rather than a feeling for others. When mobilized, it offers visceral, material, and emotional heft to acts of preservation that span a breadth of localities, selves, communities, and social worlds. This understanding of care does not preclude the possibility of interpersonal feelings of attachment to another being, but rather it broadens the scope to think of care as organized and often collective responses to structural inequities. Within her framework of the wake and wake work, Christina Sharp insists that thinking needs care and that all thought is Black thought and that thinking and care need to stay in the wake. Care is a problem for thinking about Black being and interrupting the violence enacted by the state and its attending actors. In other words, here we consider care as practices that do not seek to extend suffering. In this context, the wake is both the metaphorical and material formulation of the outer world that Hobart and Nice suggest. And the work of care is the work of survival and community reimagination. Sharp writes, living as I've argued we do in the wake of slavery, in spaces where we were never meant to survive or have been punished for surviving and for daring to claim or make spaces of something like freedom, we yet reimagine and transform spaces for and practices of an ethic of care, as in repair, maintenance, and attention, an ethic of seeing and of being in the wake as consciousness, as a way of remembering and observing that started with the door of no return, continued in the hold of the ship, and then onto the shore. These days, I think there are perhaps few relationships that just demonstrate this better, at least to me, than the relationships between people and plants. Over the past several months, one of my favorite things has been to propagate plants and gift them to friends and to loved ones. I am a hesitant propagator. It is not hyperbole to say that before I do it, I wonder if I'm hurting the plant. I worry about making a mistake. I wish it could talk to me in a language, my own language, that is easier for me to understand. Once I've propagated, I check the cuttings incessantly, checking to see if new roots are growing. It is only when I see the sprouts that I start to breathe a sigh of relief. To put it mildly, propagating stresses me out. And yet I learned so much about growth, about pruning, about how a living being can proliferate, about how what grows can and must be shared, about failure and forgiveness, about loss. I know that I'm not the only person who's turned to plants, especially during the pandemic. I scroll Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, and I see Black people cultivating plants as a source of joy and wonder. And I also see that in cultivating this joy and wonder, we're also trying to create spaces, something like freedom, where we might also process mourning and loss. Darius Carter writes, "We create spaces, platforms, environments, partnerships, theories, methods, and art that witness our freedom in their very creation." We, us, people and plants, trying to create something like freedom together in these continuously unfolding assemblages that sometimes bring unlikely characters into relation with each other. When I was preparing for this talk, I realized that the two plants I've propagated and gifted the most, a pothos plant and a spider plant, were gifted to me in 2019 when I was moving from Atlanta to Baltimore. At the time, I was not a plant parent, but I wanted to be, and a friend was helping me along with that journey. Me and those plants have moved from Atlanta to Baltimore to Austin. Their kin have traveled up and down the East Coast and across the state of Texas. These plants and their caretakers form something like a diaspora, knitted together not solely by loss or precarity or capitalist exchange, but by gift giving as a form of care. In Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer writes, "Gifts from the earth or from each other establish a particular relationship, an obligation of sorts, to receive and to reciprocate." She further argues that the nature of an object is changed or influenced by how you receive it, whether as a gift or as a commodity. This idea strikes me not only because of the significance of gift economies, but also because we are reminded that relations are never set in stone. They too are set in motion, and we make decisions about how and what motions we engage. This is a useful way for thinking about mutual aid as well. In addition to the political work it does to rethink and reimagine the distribution of resources, it is also an invitation to those who are engaged to transform something they may have acquired as a commodity into a gift, into an object of care. Here I'm thinking about the many people who purchase food and transform those purchases into meals that were distributed to community free of charge in the past couple of weeks. I'm thinking about organizations like Black Yield Institute in Baltimore, who at the beginning of the pandemic used their garden and their resources to prepare thousands of meals that were distributed to families who needed them. And I'm thinking about and reminded of the garden that I wrote about in Black Food Geographies, and how at the end of the month, when money was tight, one of the residents would take the vegetables from the garden and make large pots of soups for his neighbors who couldn't afford to go buy more groceries. All of these are examples of people responding to and moving within crisis with a type of care that eschews commodity exchange. And all of these are examples of experiments, sets of improvisation that, while not permanent, set alternative ways of being and relating into motion. So last week when I had to make the decision to cancel the keynote, I wrote in part, "The crisis part is strong right now, and there's nowhere else I can in good conscience be. Care is a verb. Mutual aid is a communal, sometimes scrappy effort. I didn't wake up this week thinking I would be organizing, but here I am. And wherever you are in the world, connect with others and organizations. The question is not if you will need mutual aid, it is when. The we and we are all we got gotta be stronger than individualism and the pull to only take care of oneself." I wrote these words from my cell phone as a quick text message to Jordan. So if there are any typos, my bad. While I felt intensely present with and committed to the work we were doing to get food, shelter, and money to people who needed it, I was also very much feeling the pull of responsibility to honor my commitment to do this keynote. I also knew that even with the talk mostly prepared, I had nothing to give to an academic audience. I didn't want to talk about theory. I only wanted to be engaged in practice. Reflecting on the past 2 weeks, I've spent a lot of time thinking about work, what work feels meaningful, valuable, and instrumental, and what work moves us closer to liberation. I've also spent a lot of time thinking about a reality that perhaps isn't often talked about enough in discourses about rest. My rest, your rest, our rest is underwritten by someone else's work and labor. Work and labor that often goes assumed or unseen. This talk that I'm giving is underwritten by my labor, something that, given the structure of the academy, is sometimes rendered invisible. You just see this video, you see the final product, not the work that went into making it. My ability to do this work is underwritten by the labor of my mother and her mother and her mother, all women who, without college educations, labored in kitchens and prisons as private caregivers. I was safe during the winter storms because of the endless, tireless labor of hotel workers, food workers, plumbers, and others. We could map endless genealogies of labor that make our worlds and our lives possible. Perhaps one of the reasons that this labor goes unnoticed, uncommented on, is because of some aspects of wellness and self-care culture. They tell us that we deserve this, that I deserve this spa day, I deserve this rest, that indeed some people deserve it more than others. I think it is also in part because underlying conversations about rest and restoration, we must also contend with the questions. What do we make of what cannot be restored? What do we know? What do we do when rest is not enough? How do we restore broken hearts and systems? And should we? I have no answers to any of those questions. I think there are questions we might approach with curiosity and openness, to feel around for answers even if or when they don't feel good. I hold them in community and intention with the realities that so much of the critical work that happens in academic and movement spaces is held up by Black women and other people of color. I hold this intention with the reality that rest itself is neither neutral nor the antidote to the multitude of violences produced daily. Yet I treat these words that I learned from my yoga teacher and mentor, Octavia Rahim, as a sort of mantra, holding them close when I feel propelled to keep going, going, going. When I think I or we can fill all the gaps. I think about the words that she often starts her restorative yoga classes with. We start by stopping. Now, just to end, I'm gonna play a song.
Black girl, we'll leave this fight to someone else for now. You can close your eyes, let your hair down. Breathe in, breathe out. Yes, there will be battles you sometimes lose. They never last for a day. In your shoes, you still need to rest too. You still need to rest too. Black girl, I know how much it hurts to always prove your worth. They won't make it easy, but baby, believe me, your Let's lay down for a while. They'll be just fine. It's okay. You can keep your magic to yourself, keep it tucked away. They'll have to find another wonder for today. You don't always have to be the one to save the world. It's okay. You can keep your magic to yourself, keep it tucked away. They'll have to find another wonder for today. You don't always have to be the one to save the world. You're always the one to save the world. And they never say thank you, girl. I love you. Good night. I love you. Good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Reese, for such a timely and vulnerable talk. And I'm very glad that you added that song in. I know I needed to hear it. And I think it's nice to have parts of what our original plan was in this abridged version. And so now we'll go into our discussion. We have prepared some questions in advance, but we want to also try to make it as conversational as we can. So I guess we'll kick it off with Helen's question.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Reese. So just following off kind of the last point that you made about our rest is underwritten by someone else's labor, and the wellness culture of social media often makes rest something that's like individualized. We were wondering, so care is often taken up through an individualizing lens, and mutual aid is an explicit way of refuting such a lens in favor of a collective and community approach. Could you talk about the ways you think rest could be approached in a way that refuses often isolated or isolating practices of self-care?
Yeah, so I mentioned my teacher, Octavia Rahim, who is the person who trained me in my yoga teacher training, but also like the first person I ever took restorative yoga with. And I remember I didn't know what restorative yoga was. And the first class I went to, I was like, so you mean I'm just gonna lay here? Like I'm not doing anything. Like this is not cool. Like I gotta lay here for an hour, right? My brain was moving. I couldn't sit still. But in that space, and in this case, this was a space of a yoga community that was co-owned by a Black woman, majority people of color went there. There was this really good energy for holding space for that antsiness. You know what I mean? You know how like when you sit down and you try to tell yourself you're ready to rest, but then your brain is thinking about all the other stuff. Like I felt like that was a space that could hold that, which is one of the first places where I started thinking about what rest means beyond just I need to like sit my own individual body down. So I think, thinking about, talking about being open within communities of care and trust is an important way to kind of counter that. I also want to give a shout out to the NAP ministry that many have probably been following for years. And one of the things that's so consistent with Trisha and the project is trying to link this exhaustion and overwork to capitalism, to racism, to patriarchy. And if you follow her work, she never talks about rest without reminding people that this isn't about someone making a decision about working 12, 14-hour days. Those decisions are linked to these crippling systems. So I think the more we can remind people of that, the better. And the more that we don't just try to, that we end up not just preaching to people about like, oh, you should have just done something differently. I think one thing that has been helpful, there are a couple of things that have been helpful for me over the years. One, plugging into broader conversations about academic labor. I think I have been learning a lot over the last couple of years, and I realized how little I knew about university structures, actually, like how things work and who's making decisions, but also how little I had thought about um, just like the different kinds of hierarchies that exist in universities, not just, we've got administration, we've got faculty, staff, adjuncts, we have those things, but also in departments themselves, just all these different tensions that might be present. And I think in learning about academic culture and structure, it's been helpful to have those conversations with other people, right? So it's not like that it's amazing to me, actually, when I think about it, how many of us work in labor in the university and we don't study the university itself, right? Like how it works and how it functions and how it gets us to do the things that we know we shouldn't be doing so much of, but we are doing it anyway, right? Working so much. So I think it's been helpful to have those conversations with other people. And then the last thing I will say that's been helpful in my own personal practice is we call them self-care check-ins, but they're kind of more community care. I have weekly community care check-ins with people. And I think that is a really helpful practice.
So I love that you brought up the NAP ministry. I know that was one of my biggest inspirations for just this year and deciding to organize and rethinking what rest looks like beyond just, as you mentioned, just sleeping on an individual level. But there's something that your second point on the academy, I think, segues perfectly into Corinne's question. So I'll go ahead and throw it over to them.
Awesome. Thank you so much again, Dr. Reese. So mutual aid is something that's been discussed very frequently this past year. However, sometimes the discussion leaves out the greater historical context of the concept. So knowing that, how do we resist depoliticizing mutual aid? And also, is there a role for mutual aid in the academy? And if so, how can we move towards that as scholars?
Yeah, those are two good and big questions. So the first question around depoliticizing mutual aid is something that I and my co-organizers, I guess we'll call it ourselves, Ashley Farmer, Bitora Lagra, and Aaron Sandel, we're talking about this very weekend. Like, we were thinking through and reflecting over the past couple of weeks, and really questioning, like, is what we're doing mutual aid? Like, many of us have been trained up to think about mutual aid specifically in the context of like political organizing and struggle. And so what does that look like in this context? And we just, and then also realizing that we come from different traditions, right? Like different traditions think and talk about mutual aid differently. Anarchist traditions might look different from Black feminist traditions, not to say they're mutually exclusive, but there are different genealogies. So I think this is a struggle for me. I'm still thinking through this because in the middle of acute crisis, people don't care what you call what they're doing. They just want their needs met. And I think that that's a really important thing to never forget, right? That like whatever we call what we're doing, if we're trying to connect it to the material needs of people, that can't that can't be secondary, right? That has to be the primary lens. So I don't know how we keep it from being depoliticized. I think it's already pretty depoliticized in some contexts, right? I think one thing we might do in our own spheres is think about and organize study, right? And I think it's important for people, this is not even just about mutual aid. I always think it's important for people to be connected to genealogies and be able to think through like how you got to where you got to, how a concept became a concept, right? There are histories there that if we're not careful, they get erased or sidelined. So I think there's that. I think a question I've been wrestling with a lot lately is, so what is the end goal, right? Like, what are we trying to get to? And I think this is where we get into conversations around how mutual aid is framed and used in different traditions, right? And as state and ecological crises continue to compound, you know, this idea of like having these survival mechanisms pending revolution, like that pending might keep getting longer and longer and longer. Does that change the context of what we do? Does that change the meaning of what we do? I don't know. But I do think that's something that I've been thinking about. And I think for here in Austin with the folks that I've been working with, it's a question we've been thinking about, like, so what does this look like long term? Do we want to organize different forms of political education? Is it okay that we're just people who get activated when there's immediate crisis? I think that's also fine, right? But I also think that there's like this longer, deeper conversation around, and people already have this, right, around mutual aid versus charity. How do we know the difference? And then how do people who are on the receiving end in an acute crisis, how do they experience the difference, or do they experience a difference? So I keep thinking about experience here because I do think that there's a deeply embodied aspect of mutual aid that I think should inform our practice.
So I'm interested to stay on this train of mutual aid, especially since you mentioned thinking through possibly keeping the infrastructure that you and your co-organizers have. And it reminded me of both the texts that you sent me that we sent to the DOPE participants of mutual aid being scrappy, which I love as a quote. And then just the process of trying to reschedule, the lack of certainty of if, how, or when this would even happen, and us staying in as much contact as we could throughout it all. It just seems so exhausting. I know I can't imagine how you would be feeling trying to think through academic stuff while doing on the ground praxis. And so I kind of relate it to two things, and I don't want to go too far in either direction. But the first, I appreciated when in your talk you mentioned not having the space to think through theory when you were in that space of doing on the ground work. And so the question that I wrote is, how do you engage with rest while giving so much of yourself to your communities, or less personally, the connections between mutual aid and rest? But then what you said about not having the space for theory and giving that energy that you had to on the ground instead makes me think more through rest beyond just sleep and stopping. Like maybe rest takes different forms depending on where you use your energy. And so I'll just leave that there. And yeah.
Okay. I just realized I didn't answer the question about mutual aid in academia. Real quick, I do think people can organize mutual aid within the context of academia. I'm gonna give a shout out to the Black Graduate Student Organization in my department, African Diaspora Studies, who have been organizing, have organized a mutual aid collective for graduate students. And so I think that's, it's important to look at what already exists at different universities. We're obviously not the only department that has had students organized. So I think it's something to think about. And I also think that mutual aid doesn't have to be a free-for-all. There can be brackets around what that looks like and like what, and in terms of what people's capacity is, because that's a question that I think we think about. I won't I won't belabor this point too much, but I do think in academic settings when we're thinking about mutual aid and organizing around mutual aid, I do think it's worth us to think about, does that unintentionally reify like university structures in a particular way that keep us disconnected from communities outside of the university? I don't have an answer, but I do think it's worth people thinking about. So Jordan, your questions around rest. So the first thing I want to say is that I think good theory gets enacted in the doing, and therefore you don't have to sit around and think about it or talk about it all day, right? So insofar as I was doing the work, it is partially underwritten by the kinds of things that I read and study and deeply believe in, right? Both academic and otherwise. I was joking with someone the other day that being someone who was born and raised in rural East Texas, I was born for this kind of crisis, right? Like I was like, I know what to take with me. I know how to do, I have some skills, right? And I think those are theories too, right? The things that I learned from my family and community growing up are things that were able to be activated. So that's the first thing that I want to say, because I did want to clarify that I don't necessarily think theory has to be separate from practice, but at some point theory has to be activated to make sense. It needs to be able to be put into some kind of practice in service to something. At least that's how I think about theory. In terms of rest and stuff beyond sleeping, my latest practice has been coloring. And I realized this in the last couple weeks, that it is my happy medium between doing absolute nothing and like trying to work, right? Because here's, I asked the question in the presentation around, is rest possible during acute crises? My personal experience is that it felt very difficult, but I still felt like I needed something to settle. So I started coloring. So my hands could be moving, something is moving, but I'm not like engaging in work. I wasn't doing a bunch, trying to take some time off. So I do think that there are other forms of rest that aren't just about sleeping. I also walk a lot. And I read a lot of fiction, which is helpful to me. It has been a lifelong practice, but particularly when I went to grad school, I made a concerted commitment to always read fiction. Then that commitment has stuck with me. So here's the other thing about rest that I think is important. And I mean, I know I said this in a little bit in the talk, which is that rest is not neutral. Rest itself is gendered, it's classed, it's racialized, it's all these things. And I feel like rest is something that, depending on how you are socially located, both in or outside the academy, you just have to fight for. And the fighting for space to rest is also sometimes exhausting, right? The amount of times you have to tell someone no, for example, or the amount of times you have to tell someone like, you can't do a thing, or no matter how quickly they think it is, right? Like the amount of times, which is the equivalent essentially of saying the amount of times you have to claim space for yourself on your own terms because other people are not believing the space that you have claimed for yourself on your own terms, right? That can get exhausting. So yeah, so I think, I have those very specific kinds of practices. I'm obviously a yogi. That has been harder for me during the pandemic. I think practicing alone feels different for me than practicing in community. And I think that's something to think about. I'm also a meditator. So that's how I start most of my days, and sometimes end my days. Yeah, I think, the other thing, last thing I'll say about rest is that I do think there's a community practice, but I also think that rest, it can be and is deeply personal in terms of what feels restful to certain people and what doesn't, right? If you're someone who's afraid to be alone and you don't particularly like rural spaces, you probably shouldn't get a cabin in the woods. You're just gonna be stressed the fuck out the entire time, right? Just don't do that. Don't do that because you read that in a magazine and thought it would be cool. Like, just don't. It's not going to be a good look, right? So I think, or like if you have this spa day, I'll just use like, you know, an example that lots of people can relate to. You have the spa day plan, you're looking forward to it, and when you get there, you realize like the people who are working there are looking at you funny because you're the only Black woman in the space, or people don't want to share a sauna with you. Like that disrupts a practice, right? So I think people, it's not only thinking about your physical needs, your emotional needs, you also got to think about space and context. And that can be, you know, that can be hard. That can be exhausting. It can be a deterrent. And then, oh wait, I have one more thing to say about rest, which is, if you are someone who has taken on a lot of responsibility because you have internalized or feel mobilized by taking on responsibility, rest is really difficult. And one of the things that during the height of our organizing over the past 2 weeks, and we would do these check-ins. I wish I could have meetings via WhatsApp all the time, because we would just do text check-ins. I was like, yes, please, this is great. But anyway, we would have these check-ins. And one of the things that became very clear was that people felt guilty about taking breaks from cooking or from driving or doing drop-offs, right? And I think we had to keep reminding each other that while this is a practice and one that we're committed to, we're not responsible for the failures of the state. We're not responsible for the failures of the university. You're not responsible for the failures of your department or your grad program or. And I think that is something that probably people who are prone toward taking on a lot of responsibility need lots of reminders about. You're not responsible if you have a program and there are only 2 faculty of color, and then you admit grad students who don't have support. Like they're like, those are the kinds of structural things that I think we're moving within and sometimes trying to overcome, but also like we cannot fully take on as our kind of individual responsibility.
Wow. Everything you're saying feels so deeply personal, but I feel like it just speaks to how common this all is, just the overwork and feelings of responsibility and having to fight for and claim rest. So in the interest of time, I'll go back to the theme of when you were talking about things that sustain you through this rest, because Chris has a really interesting question about plants.
Hello, Dr. Reese. So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about plants. I love your thoughts on plant care and how to facilitate interpersonal connections of care in this very material way. And I'm particularly reminded of my own practices of plant exchange and stories from family members and elders around seed work and garden work, and even propagation, sometimes in like surprisingly fugitive ways. So I wonder if you could speak a little more about what you're excited to be growing now, as well as how that care for other than humans or more than humans or non-humans reflects back on our politics, our research, and our being in the world.
Yeah, Chris, that's a really good question. Yeah, so, you know, I like to tell the story about how, like, growing up, my grandmother, first of all, again, grew up in a rural area. Everybody grew stuff, so there was that. But I spent the most time with my grandmother, who had a garden in the back of her house. And, you know, if I would come home from school and my grandmother lived next door. I'm telling you, like, I'm country, right? Like, so there's my house and my grandmother's house was next door. So I'd come home from school, my mom worked a lot. First stop would be to my grandmother's house. And like, I have vivid memories of going through her front door, calling her name, not finding her, and knowing to go immediately through the back door, and then she would be out in her garden. And the thing that always sticks with me about my grandmother is that I can't say that she was the best grower, right? like everyone tells these stories about like their grandparents having these green thumbs. And I think she did, right? But like she also, but what I will say is that she was such a good learner. Like she would study those plants. She would ask people, like if someone down the road was growing collard greens and they looked better than her, she would ask them like what they were doing, you know, so that she could improve her own practice. And I think as an adult, I look back, this is what we do, right? Hindsight is always 2020. I look back and I'm like, wow, I should have spent a lot more time learning the technical skills of like gardening with her. But while I didn't learn a lot of technical skills, what I did, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how much her joy and delight from gardening, how much I remember that, like how much I remembered um, how satisfied she would be when something would grow that she didn't think was going to grow, or like the bounties that she was able to get from her garden, or the exchange, which was such a huge part of the community I grew up in. People did a lot of gift exchanging. So so I say all of that to say that like part of what's been interesting with cultivating mostly house plants, I'm gonna start a balcony garden. Maybe I'm kind of excited about it. Not a lot because it'll stress me out, but just enough to like try some new things. But what's been really interesting to me about cultivating house plants is they have been a source of remembering for me. Like um, they're like I will have memories of stuff that I have not thought about in a very long time through cultivating plants, um, which for me reminds me and kind of like reiterates to me how much some form of embodied practice means to me. For some people, that's going to be dancing. For some people, that's yoga. Oftentimes for me, it's yoga. But in the middle of a pandemic where I have found my yoga practice struggling, plants have really filled the gap for me, right? In terms of like the kind of knowledge that it produces, not just that I need to exercise my body, but like the knowledges that an embodied practice can produce. So I think, you know, I have like, I mentioned the pothos plant and the snake plant, I'm sorry, and the spider plant, and I love them precisely for the reasons that I mentioned, but also because, yo, listen, y'all, I drove from Baltimore to Austin when I moved here over the summer, and I took this long road trip and I packed up all these plants and I put them in my car. And, you know, like it's hot in the summertime. And I took this long road trip. Anyway, when I was leaving from Austin to drive to Jackson, Mississippi, to then drive from Jackson to Austin, I had left the plants in my car and it got too hot. You know, like, and you know, plants get too hot and they start to burn or they start to look really sad. So I am driving in my car from Austin to Jackson, Mississippi, um, just talking to these plants. And I get to Jackson and I'm staying in a hotel, and I asked the person to help me carry all my plants inside so that I can water them and they can get warm, and I wasn't gonna, or get cooler, and I wasn't gonna leave them. And I was so worried. Like my friend Kendall, who had gifted me, one of the stops on my road trip was Durham, and my friend Kendall had gifted me plants. And so I was accumulating plants along my road trip. And I called Kendall and I was like, I'm really sad. Look at all my plants. I'm really sad. Like they're gonna die. Like I was having a whole moment. And then I woke up the next morning and like the spider plant had been, y'all, I wish you could have seen it. I'm actually kind of like sad about the memory, but it was just toppled over. When I woke up in the morning, it was like, you could see it was recovering. And so that plant is one of my favorites because of just what that reminded me of, right? That like, it's all right to make mistakes. Like I probably shouldn't have left the plants in my car. Um, and we can survive some mistakes. Plants can survive some mistakes. They teach us so many things around that. I also think that, you know, I mentioned in the talk that I wish plants spoke my language. And I in thinking about that now, after I read it, even when I was reading it, I was like, oh man, like this is so human centric. It's also so English centric and all these other things. And it got me to thinking about how, like, the other thing that plants teach me is to listen differently. Because if a plant is dying, It's not telling me why, and I gotta try to figure it out. But I also have to be okay with if the thing that they're telling me is that it's their time to die, which is a hard thing for me. Like the loss of plants has been an interesting experience for me in thinking about like life and loss and regeneration and like all these different things. So yeah, like so I love the spider plant. It's very special to me. And also because it was a gift to me from like a plant that was propagated. So like that chain is really interesting. And let me see. I'm looking around at the other plants in here. I would say the most challenging plant for me right now is I have two Paleas and I keep losing leaves and I can't figure out why. I've moved them all around the house. I've tried more or less water. I've tried like more humidity, tried more or less sunlight, and I haven't figured it out. But they're not dead yet. So I'm like, we're just gonna keep trying. So I think there's this level of experimentation and a willingness to be wrong and to be attached to a thing that you know you're supposed to be taking care of, but like that care might not be enough too. Like I think there's a lot of different things that teaches me, and I mean I'm assuming that this is also partly what people experience when they have pets, right? That they're new, they learn different ways of relating that then teach them more things about how to relate to self and to humans, right? So it becomes this interconnected web of different forms of knowledge making. So I think, I mean, I could say more about plants, but I think that I'll stop there.
So we're almost, well, pretty much at time, but we have one more question from Annalise. So Annalise?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Again, like everyone said, and I want to turn a little bit towards grad students. And so as grad students faced with obligations to teach, provide departmental service, take courses, plan research projects, et cetera, all with a forward-facing lens, how do we make sure that we instill care into ourselves, our work, and the communities we engage with, operating within the neoliberal academy that we exist within?
You know, these questions are always interesting, and I always feel a little hesitancy with answering them because obviously I'm someone who survived grad school, who then got a tenure track job or several different jobs, and I'm doing all right. And I always think about like there are probably lessons that we need to be learning from people who didn't, and like what are the ways that how have these spaces been harmful or toxic? And I mean, we all have stories, but I always, in my mind, that's what I'm thinking about, like the people who we never get to hear from because they didn't finish their program or didn't get a tenure track job, or because they have a tenure track job but not at the right institution, and so nobody's listening to them. I think about that a lot. But so the first thing I want to say to graduate students and potential graduate students is my early lessons in trying to take good care of myself as a grad student in particular came from my advisor, Rachel Watkins, who was one of the speakers last year. And this comes up in a lot of talks where I love to talk about Rachel. But Rachel really taught me through doing that mentorship could look like caring more about me as a person than the research that I was going to produce. So, I have a couple of examples. Like I went through a breakup in grad school. Rachel was the first person I called, like not my friends. I don't know if that's weird, but I called my academic advisor, right? And oh my gosh, I can't believe her name is escaping me, but young Black woman who was shot in the face when she approached the porch, white man's porch for help. Can't remember her name right now. But when that happened, I was in graduate school, and besides the fact that this was a young Black woman, in addition to the fact that this was a young Black woman who got shot in the face when she was asking for help, it struck me very specifically because at the time I was a graduate student who spent a lot of my time approaching the houses of white people because I was babysitting or nannying their kids. And the day that she was murdered, I was supposed to babysit that night for a family and wasn't going to get there until after dark. And I was sitting in my car, like terrified and like trying to call them so that they would know I was going to be coming up on the porch because I didn't want to walk up to their door without them, all of these different things. And so Rachel cared about that kind of stuff, right? Like she's the person that I told about how I was feeling in those moments. But also, Rachel taught me that rigor is a process. And I say this to my own grad students. And part of what that process looked like is we would spend lots of, I have no idea now thinking, now that I'm on the other side of this, I'm like even more in awe of the amount of time Rachel spent with me. But we would often have meetings off campus during times when my department didn't feel particularly good for me. We would have meetings off campus. She would meet with me for long periods of time. She also trusted that my process might not have been linear, but it was mine and like we could roll with it. So my first thought is that like the relationships that one has with their mentors, maybe it's not even your formal advisor. I think those are some of the first places that we might think about shaping a relationship to care that is not solely informed by the hierarchies that are imposed on us in academia. So there's that. I also think, so I came to grad school after teaching middle school, which burned me completely out. And what I learned from teaching middle school was that this is going to sound antithetical to talking about care, but I learned through teaching middle school that there is kind of a such thing as caring too much, right? And you know, what made me start thinking that is teaching middle school. Schools, you know, get to school by 7 a.m., sometimes staying at school till 6, 7, 8 p.m., and also doing a lot of running around to kind of meet needs of students and their families, and then also the school and I think that that was useful for me because by the time I got to graduate school, I was like, I get to set boundaries around my time, and that's okay, right? But it also meant that, so let me just say it like this. I think you have to decide how you want to spend your time. And I think you have to decide if you're at peace with not being able to do everything, and if you're at peace with losing some opportunities because of how you've chosen to bracket your time. I'm not going to pretend that choosing, you know, when I was in graduate school, I committed to getting 8 hours of sleep every night. I didn't get 8 hours of sleep every night, but it was a commitment and I honored that commitment mostly. I also was okay with not getting an academic job if it meant that I had to be working all the time. So I think, you know, those are things that you have to think about. I think graduate school can be isolating, but it doesn't have to be. Like, I think being in community with other graduate students, but also, you know, one of the things that I also learned from Rachel, and now I'm thinking about it as just like, again, like her generosity, was that I needed a network of care. So I had Rachel, but Rachel also introduced me to her colleagues who were at other universities who could be there and be a support intellectually or otherwise for me. And then my really good friend, Bianca, we talk a lot about the different kind of who's above us, who's below us, who's at our level, and how do we make sure we're connected with people at all of these different junctures. And I think that's been really valuable too, like being able to be connected to grad students makes me pause about how we do our work as academics, but being connected to senior scholars, they give me so much wisdom around how to navigate this space. And then my peers, we're going through it together, you know? So I think networks of care really, really matter. So this might seem a little tangential, but I think it's useful. I also think it's worth it to think about what kind of scholar you want to be. Because if you don't, other people will decide for you, and that can pull you into lots of different directions that feel exhausting. So I think thinking through what kind of scholar you want to be and who do you do this work for? And if the answer is truly just yourself and because you like the intellectual work and you need a job, that's okay. You don't have to pretend like you want to do it for some other stuff, right? But I do think like those kinds of honest conversations with yourself really, really matter. Oh, sorry. Last thing I'm going to say is I think the connection between play and rest is really important. I think, as academics, we are trained to be an expert in an area, to know all the things about that area. And play gives us an opportunity to be wrong and to fail within a context where there is low stakes. So for me, a few years ago, I started learning how to rollerblade. I still cannot break properly, but it was really fun, you know. And then I take up other things, like my current kind of obsession is hula hooping. I enjoy it. It's fun. And I watch all these women on Instagram to learn new tricks with the hula hoop. So I think you just have to find things that aren't about mastering them, but just about the art and the form and the opportunity to play. I think that is another form of rest, actually, that can also be like deeply creative and energizing for people who have creative tendencies. So.
Okay, I think as a graduate student run conference, that's probably the best possible place we could have ended. And so before we stop the recording, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Reese, for all of the labor that you put into this and for committing to doing this with us. Thank you so much. And thank you for sticking with us to the end.
Of course. Thank you again for inviting me. Thank you for being flexible. I just want to say that on the record. Like, there are a lot of things many people could learn from you all about how to handle email and rescheduling with a lot of patience. So I really, really appreciate you all.
I don't even know what to say. It was an honor to work with you on this, and it was an honor to be flexible with you while you were saving lives. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess that's the end of the recording. If we want to